Hello, everybody. David will be joining me here in just a second, and we will be talking about character arcs. This is sort of based on a discussion that we saw on Twitter, sparked by Fiona Wolf, and we just wanted to talk about what we thought about it and our preferences, and then maybe come up with some examples of stuff that we both that we know from mainstream traditional publishing, movies, and also some indie examples as well. To start out the stream, I will talk about some indie news. These haven't quite hit the website yet, but wanted to share them with you. Adam Furman has a story in the Cursova issue, and we reviewed his book Collateral Damage, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm excited to share that with you, and encourage you to check out that entire magazine. Also, Donald continues to release ebooks. He's released The King of Cats and In the Ruins of Emir since my last news blip about the wolves one. Now I can't remember what that one was called, but we reviewed The Kidnapped Mouseling from his Jiao-Chu's endeavor. So again, a good one to check out, and we encourage you to do so. Okay.
We want to position the camera here.
I can try.
What did we do last time?
I don't remember.
Did you maybe just aim the camera over a little bit more?
Could be.
Or you could aim your computer. I think that's cut off a little bit too. As soon as I get it up on my computer, we'll be able to tell better. I think down there.
Yeah.
See it.
Yep.
All right. Hey, everyone.
I don't know if I introduced myself. Usually I do. I'm Katie Roome from Periapsis Press.
And I'm David Roome.
So the discussion today is about character arcs, and we're inspired by Fiona Wolf's discussion about flat arc versus dynamic characters, and she's sort of talking against people who prefer dynamic and say that they dislike flat as like a blanket statement. I think her second tweet that I have big there kind of captures how I feel about it too, that one isn't inherently better. But I tend to prefer more dynamic myself, which is perhaps contrary to what a lot of people in the replies feel. I know that flat arc is popular with Pulp Rev in particular. So since we're sort of adjacent to those circles, thought we would talk about this a little bit. Fiona points out in the chat that flat arc is definitely the one that is less, she says, underfed, right? Less generally approved of, in kind of a
certainly in trad pub.
Yeah, in kind of a disparaging tone.
And I think if you're trying to analyze a work in the context of some formula, a lot of formulas demand certain kinds of arcs for characters and have certain well-defined roles for characters. So I think that's maybe something to point out right away, is that probably the formulas that Pulprev likes don't necessarily demand those kinds of things, but other genres, not the kind of adventure genre, but horror, or for sure things like romance or other things might demand certain kinds of arcs for certain characters with certain roles. So I don't want to talk in terms of better or worse, because it's all sort of genre dependent. And if we're talking about stories that sort of mix or take elements from different genres, you could see interesting things happening in different combinations and unexpected ways. But.
Yeah, I would say romance is the easy one to see it for sure, where a dynamic arc would be most common, largely in following that sort of Pride and Prejudice beat, where you have characters that appear opposed and have to be reconciled in order to move forward with their relationship. What was the other one you mentioned?
Horror. There's often an arc of the horror protagonist maybe coming face to face with the horror elements that they're encountering and growing and changing in certain ways in response to that.
Often in horror, the horror element is symbolic of some internal problem or fear.
Yeah, maybe something that they had in their past that they have to deal with and overcome. That's another common thing in the thriller genre too. So oftentimes, and thrillers kind of similar to horror, but good thrillers often have a character who has some issue in their past that they haven't come to terms with,
right?
And then they're forced to deal with that alongside a bigger threat.
Yep. Let's see. So then later in the conversation, touched on the negative to positive dynamic arc as being, Fiona Wolf says, kind of the go-to. So particularly perhaps in an effort to be more mature, and Tish Tosh Tesh pointed out that it might link into like reader insert characters, where they want their readers or audience members want the flawed character, the one that they identify with, to be flawed at first so that they can identify with them. I'm not so sure that I buy into that quite, but I kind of understand what she's going for there. The sense that there is redemption possible is important. I don't think that that's negative necessarily, but I kind of understand what she's saying.
Yeah, I think that's actually something that I think is kind of positive about tradition, like trad pub or current day movie storytelling, is the idea that villains can be redeemed. I know that's maybe not necessarily super popular in our circles, but I think it's kind of a neat idea. I think it has to be executed properly in the story. You can't just have a character be redeemed without any consequences necessarily.
Yeah.
Because that kind of rings false or isn't realistic. But it's something that people seem to like, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. It has to be done well with all of these. Obviously, it would need to be done well.
Like make sense within the external conflict and the plot and the rules of the world that you've established.
Yeah. Can you think of any examples of negative to positive dynamic arc that you enjoy?
That one's tough. It's easier to think of examples that aren't done well.
Sure.
Or this kind of touches on some of our conversation that we had in the villains talk. Sometimes you see something where somebody sort of turns good at the last moment. I mean, the classic example would be Darth Vader.
Sure.
You have a evil character who kind of changes their ways or repents at the last moment. I can't really think of.
Patrick suggests Han Solo.
I know people want people like the whole Han shot first thing and want to make Han Solo out to be a kind of a bad guy at the beginning. I never saw him that way.
But he's not.
Actually, he's not a villain. He's not a villain or
right.
or an evil character. But he changes from being very selfish to being
right, which would be a negative.
Yeah, but
he goes from being defined by a negative characteristic to a positive one.
Yeah, I think maybe I was sort of confusing. Something else I was thinking about is, and maybe we can touch on later, is the idea that a character can be still likable while they're flawed.
Sure.
And I think Han Solo is never a not likable character. He's likable even when he's in his sort of selfish state.
Yeah.
And he's funny and charismatic, and he becomes less selfish, but he's never not likable.
Yeah. And I think that might be.
I mean, villains can be likable too.
Right.
But I think there's a distinction between, protagonists that you like and maybe characters who aren't protagonists that you also find likable, and then villains.
Yeah.
So it's maybe an important distinction.
Yeah. I agree that the conversation becomes a little bit muddied on Twitter with the idea of likable. So because when dynamic characters are done poorly, they tend to be alienating at the beginning. Instead of sympathizing with them as a reader, you just dislike them. It kind of muddied the conversation. But I would say that a dynamic character arc is one where the character goes from being defined by a negative trait to being defined by a positive trait.
Maybe a example, and again, there might be a better category to talk about this in, but would be Snape from Harry Potter. He's a good character from the beginning, but he's not somebody that you like. He's a constant annoyance and source of grief for the protagonist. But then he doesn't really change, but you find out more about his motives, and he has an arc where you kind of go from just not liking him at all to being a lot more sympathetic, and then seeing how he was a good guy all along, and maybe appreciating him in the end.
Yeah.
He didn't go from being evil to good necessarily.
Right. Yep. I am less familiar with Tarzan, except the Disney version. I apologize. So I'm not really able to comment on that one.
I think
Fiona Wolf is giving a whole bunch of flat arcs. So nice. And Sherlock Holmes, of course. There is definitely a time and place for flat art characters, and obviously a lot of these are highly beloved. One thing of note is that Sherlock Holmes is the detective who's outside of the mystery. If you have a mystery that where the character is much more involved in the unfolding of the events, a dynamic character is almost a necessity, in the sense that you as a reader begin to understand more about the traits that define them, not necessarily that they themselves change.
Yeah, and that's an important thing.
Something we'll get into a little bit more here in a bit.
And I think that maybe it's been a long time since I've read any of the Sherlock Holmes books or stories, but I think that's maybe something that I would say is true of Sherlock Holmes. So maybe over the course of the stories or the books, you kind of come to sympathize with him a little bit more as a character. So he doesn't necessarily change, but he still has a bit of an arc in that you get more insight into the way he thinks and what his struggles. The modern adaptations always play up the drug thing, but that's still a thing in the books, and kind of helps you understand his neuroses and behavior.
Yeah. So Patrick pointed out a dynamic negative to positive character that is pretty well known would probably be Edmund from Chronicles of Narnia, particularly The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. And yes, I would say definitely that is an example of what I'm talking about, where he's defined by a resentment towards his family, and then moves into a place of repentance. So that's, and then and
it isn't just repentance in words. Again, it's been a long time since I've read Chronicles of Narnia, but once he repents of his actions, he helps out and is brave and fights and stuff like that. So,
and then in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he's
now a foil to Eustace, a different annoying character.
Another annoying character.
the annoying reader insert character that C.S. Lewis puts in there so he can indirectly lecture kids about what happens when they're bad.
Yep. I'm trying to think about the indies that I've read lately, and I would say that most of them don't really have negative to positive character arcs. And I think that's just because they don't want their characters to be disliked at the beginning, which is a completely valid concern. And I am not really suggesting that any of them would benefit from it, the stories themselves.
Yeah, it's an optional thing.
Yeah,
it's something that it's a choice like genre or anything else.
Yeah, maybe it's not negative to positive as dramatically as someone like Edmund, but something like Uriel's Revenge or Made in His Image, where the character goes from, well, like in Uriel's Revenge, which is David's book, the main character goes from a very conflicted relationship where he doesn't feel quite right, but he thinks that that's where he should be. And in that area of his life, he's sort of defined by a negative trait of sort of
conflict,
not quite infidelity, but there's definitely that conflict sort of there in kind of undertones, to a place of, spoilers, less that.
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah, he kind of solves his relationship problems by the end, and is much more settled in his mind about what the right thing to do is. Yeah.
I'm trying to think. For some reason, I felt that Made in His Image did something kind of similar, but now I'm thinking I must be thinking of something else.
I don't think so. That book has a lot of maybe anti-hero type characters, or protagonists that are kind of coming together that have different goals.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't really call any of them negative to positive.
Yeah. Fiona Wolf points out side characters being unlikable is acceptable. Much more acceptable, perhaps. We've sort of just been talking about characters in general. Having a main character go from negative to positive is harder.
Yeah,
for sure. There's a reason that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe starts with Lucy and not with Edmund.
And I mean, I don't think likability is necessarily correlated with good or evil.
Right.
I think it's harder to have an evil, likable character as the protagonist. Something I enjoy a lot in stories are sort of bad side characters who are likable, because I find characters likable if they're doing things that make sense, and if they have their own moral code and treat other characters with respect, even if they disagree with them or have some kind of fight. But there's a lot of those characters that I would call likable who are not good, not protagonists, and it would be really hard to start the story with them being the protagonist and expect the audience or reader to sympathize with them.
Yeah. I know you guys were talking a lot about various flat arc character examples. I trying to think about examples of good flat arc characters. I really liked, speaking of Adam Furman, Collateral Damage, I would say, is a flat arc character who goes from wanting to save his son to saving his son. Spoiler alert. but like instead, rather than going from like a negative trait to a positive trait, or a shift in traits, there's more of a doubling down, ratcheting up the tension and the intensity that he is needed. So yeah, faithfulness and perseverance and paternal love, that kind of stuff.
You could make an argument that one example of a flat arc character would be one that starts out good and doesn't really have any moral failings, and then they're just required to make greater and greater sacrifices or harder and harder choices, and they make the right choice every time. So the stakes get higher.
Yes.
And they sort of become better, but it's not a transition from being bad to good. They're just shown to be of better and better, moral caliber.
Yes. Yeah.
One example of a character like this that I really like, and I don't know if I would use the flat arc terminology or whatever for this, but I think it could be considered that way. One example of a character I really like in this way is Celine from Underworld. So I just watched that movie on Saturday, so I've been thinking a lot about it. It's one of my favorites. And with her, she's a vampire and she's a death dealer. So her job basically as a vampire is hunting werewolves to protect the vampire clan or coven or whatever. And I don't know if she's necessarily a good guy, but she seems to be good and competent. And I don't know, me watching the movie at the beginning, it's like, okay, she's the vampire protecting her clan from werewolves, seems fine. So I don't have any issue with her.
Mm-hmm.
She's not like a bad character. And then throughout the movie, she's confronted with, more and more information that reveals maybe some bad things about her friends. And she's put in this spot where has to take responsibility for, I think, Michael, his name is. And it's like every time she's confronted with more information about things that reveal things or is put into a situation where she has to protect Michael, it's like she makes the right choice. And she just she goes from just this kind of average, competent, I'm kind of fine with her as a character, whatever, to being somebody that you really like because she makes the right moral choice at every turn.
Yep.
Maybe a lot of superhero characters are like that.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
Maybe like somebody like Captain America. I don't know. It's like he's never a bad guy. The stakes get higher and higher, and he just keeps being a better and better guy.
Yep. Zuko from the old Airbender show.
Oh, geez, yeah.
How could I overlook that one? Yeah. A lot of the Airbender characters have an arc. Not Zuko is the most dramatic, but Aang goes from being defined by irresponsibility, sort of flippant, to taking responsibility, fulfilling his role. He never loses his playful traits, but he does begin to understand better as he matures when a tone of more seriousness is required. Let's see who else has an arc. Katara, she has a similar smaller arc, not so evil antagonist villain of the story to a positive, but there's change that occurs in all of their characters. They're very dynamic. Sorry, I'm catching up in the chat. So Misha Burnett brought up the idea of a character going from likable to likable throughout their entire arc. Mm-hmm. And this is where the waters got muddied a little bit between with between like dynamic as far as growth and sympathetic, likable qualities. And he talks about, he says it seems that the character either starts off unpleasant and gets better, or starts off decent and then becomes a monster but gets worse.
I think at a high level, I'd say a lot of the characters that we've talked about, and a lot of characters in indie books, are like this. If you would count the example that I gave as somebody who starts out as a good person and then is just tested by different threats or moral choices or opportunities that they just kind of ace. You could call that a flat arc character, or you could call it this, where they're likable and they stay likable or get better.
Yep.
I don't know if it's not necessarily done intentionally. It's just in the course of a story, stakes are raised. And if the protagonist just continues to rise to meet them, that's just what happens.
Right. Yeah. What I responded to this with was a couple of trad pub examples. One being Bilbo Baggins, who his growth is very he goes from being defined by his Baggins side to incorporating more adventure and tookishness, but he never loses those Baggins characteristics, and instead learns to apply them in his fantastic setting among the wise, right? And then another was Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, where the characters, their situation causes them to change how they're applying their characteristics. So maybe that is still what we were talking about with like a flat arc character that's just continuing to prove their positive traits.
Again, just going back to the definition, what is a character arc? I don't think a character arc has to be this character changes in some fundamental way.
Right.
It can be. They can have certain qualities where they grow and change, or their viewpoint changes or something. Or it can just be, an arc can also be we learn more about a character. So that's a common thing for side characters often is the protagonist. They don't necessarily change, but the protagonist learns more about their origins and kind of what makes them do what they do. But the arcs don't have to be the character changing in a fundamental way.
Right. Yeah.
So there would be lots of kinds of arcs that aren't that this would hold true for.
Right. Yeah.
I feel like sometimes in that flat arc versus not flat arc discussion, it's like the only choices are presented as flat arc, or the character goes from very bad, flawed, just bad person to good person. And that's, there's a whole range of things in between.
Right. Yeah. It's not fair to choose the worst examples of each.
Mm-hmm. Mentioned Celine from Underworld is fitting into this.
Yep. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've read any indie stuff where the character wasn't likable at the beginning, and stayed likable. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that everything that I've read is flat arc. Drasselmeyer, that is a dynamic character, I would say, especially, I haven't read the third book yet, but especially from book 1 to book 2, where he has a catastrophic event occur to him that fundamentally changes how he looks at life. That's, you wouldn't expect a character to stay the same when they encounter some of the things that fantasy and sci-fi throw at them. So there's that.
Yeah, just going off what you said about indie characters being likable, I think that's a real strength of indie fiction. Sometimes the trad pop stuff definitely leans too hard into the, the character has to change from a bad person to a good person, so they just fall way too hard into the range of being unlikable.
Yeah.
I think this is a common complaint you hear about kind of YA type books. There's a annoying, there's an annoying female protagonist that just is too coarse and too jokes at the wrong things and is just not a good person ever. And never, or maybe she changes, but it takes too long. People lose interest.
There's a lot of especially in YA, main female protagonist is unlikable, but instead of her changing, she's flat and she gets to lecture other people. That's a whole nother box of worms. Okay. Patrick asks, is unlikable and annoying different, or can unlikable ever be good? Side character, yes, certainly. Main character, you would have to be drawing the reader through that beginning stages of the character's development with something else to keep them reading.
And certainly for a main villain or main antagonist, they don't have to be likable. They could be, but I don't think they have to be. And I think really powerful villains typically aren't likable. You don't sympathize with them if they don't. I think for me, what makes a character likable, even if they're antagonist, is, like I mentioned, they follow some kind of moral code, and you can reason about what they do and see their motivations, and they maybe treat others with respect or things like that. An example of that would be in Kill Bill. There's a lot of sort of likable antagonists. Most of the other assassins that the bride is trying to kill are likable. But then if you have a character that's sort of so extreme and weird and terrible or frustrating, then that can make a really powerful villain, and that would be a character that wouldn't be likable.
Fiona Wolf mentions House, which makes me think of that modern Sherlock with us who had a similar personality. I never watched House. I saw clips of it. But I think probably it had similar things to Sherlock, where you liked other characters on the show.
And House is kind of funny. So House is abrasive and mean and selfish, but he's got this kind of almost dry sense of humor that you kind of laugh at. And I think that sort of being funny maybe covers a multitude of sins. Whereas the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock isn't really funny. He's just kind of mean.
But it fulfilled a lot of Schadenfreude, I think, because you wanted to see him smack down idiots a little bit.
Yeah.
And in shows there's a visual component, so a good looking character can get away with stuff that you can't get away with in a book. But again, not for forever. I feel like part of the problem with the Sherlock show was that it got old. Paula Ritchie brought up reader understanding. We've touched on this a little bit, particularly Snape. Especially side characters, where you as a reader are the one whose understanding and perception of the character is what changes. She mentions the neighbor in Home Alone and Ariel's dad as we get older. Misha Burnett mentioned a couple of other characters, but I didn't see them as applying quite so well. So as far as reader understanding, any kind of story that withholds information from the reader at the beginning is going to qualify, I think. You mentioned Snape already. Now I'm trying to come up with other ones.
Yeah, so this would be over against the example that we talked about where it's like a protagonist that is confronted with higher and higher stakes, but maybe an antagonist who maybe you're not sure of their motives, and then you learn more and then they become clearer, or maybe anti-hero, or somebody who would appear to be an antagonist but turns out to be a protagonist because you learn more.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think you see this a lot in characters who turn evil.
Sure.
Right? But they've really been evil the whole time. You just didn't think.
Yeah.
You just didn't think that they were. Indiana Jones movies, there's a couple of those where there's like I think in Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's a character that is Indy's friend, but then he turns out that he's working with the Nazis, if I remember right. I would say this is also probably not super common in indie fiction.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe just something that people don't like very much. They don't like making a character that you maybe like turn out to be evil, and it's hard. I think it's hard to do too.
I don't want to spoil anything, but Zhao Endeavor had a character like that. I think that a character, it takes a lot more planning, I think, to write a character like that. Somehow Rowling pulled that up. But she did have it in mind for a long, long time before the final book. So there was a little more intentionality to his character than some of the other aspects of her wizarding world. But when it comes to indie, especially, the pulp rev movement is a lot faster. These guys are churning out books at a pace that TradPub could never pull off. So there isn't quite so much of that. I think there's less of an inclination to write characters like that take more of a slow reveal.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different reasons for it. And then just to point out too, so here we're talking about reader understanding. So, saying that this is a place where the sort of good to bad character arc happens, but it's like we as the reader are learning that the character was bad all along.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of different from a character actually turning bad.
Right.
I think like a good character actually turning bad is pretty rare.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite hard to pull off.
Yeah. Believably, for sure.
Yep.
I think that's part of why Daenerys, is that how you pronounce it?
Daenerys, yeah.
In Game of Thrones, why the conclusion of that show made people so angry.
Oh yeah.
It was because they failed to pull that off believably.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just people really liked her as a character, so it was a betrayal.
Yeah.
I think she, I didn't really watch the show, but I watched through her arc on YouTube one afternoon, and I thought it was really cool and compelling. And it would be a bummer if you liked your character to see her go insane or whatever happened to her.
Yeah.
I think it was more played as her kind of going insane than actually turning evil, but I don't know. Yeah.
I did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't want to watch all this other crap.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other positive ones that are similar to like Snape, where instead of a character revealed to be evil, they're revealed to actually have been good all along. Yeah, I don't know.
It's tricky.
Yeah. I think that one's even harder.
Yeah, it's hard because you in order to think that a character is bad, they have to actually do bad things.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have a character that does bad things that end up being excusable enough for them to have been good all along.
Right. Sorry, excuse me.
Like if about the best you can do is a character's undercover or something, but then if they're letting bad things happen all around them, then they're kind of morally
or like children's stories where the main character is under a wrong impression about someone, but that's kind of like a morality tale, like don't judge a book by its cover.
Another fairy tale thing that you see sometimes is sort of related to this is a character that's under a spell.
Oh, sure.
So you'll have a good character who seems to be evil, but actually turns out to be just the pawn of some other person. But then that's hard to really say they went from being evil to good. Right. It wasn't really them that was doing the bad things. Yep. I tend, when I see that kind of thing, I tend to just instantly forgive the character. Yeah. Like if it was actually, they were literally being controlled by somebody else, it's like, well.
Yeah, that's.
But that is sometimes where you see that kind of thing happen.
Yep. That's all I had.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I had. Let's see. There's Hellgate. That's a romance, indie romance.
That's Morgan Newquist, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
That love triangles are kind of the exception to the romance dynamic character arc. Because I was saying that most romance would be dynamic characters. And now I'm thinking maybe not. If we're defining flat arc as if we're including characters that just continue to apply their same traits, but at the same time, there's also especially in romance, somebody has to give, as far as letting go of stubbornness, letting go of preconceived notions of wrongs or stuff. So I would still say that's an arc. I would say that's a small arc, probably. But
so what's the love triangle connection
with love triangles? The who will she choose has to be maintained. So the character's arc has to be flattened and held in that same that limbo sort of state.
You mean the characters can't change in a way that would make her obviously change who she would pick?
Right.
Well, sure, but they could all be changing. They could all be changing and still maintain a difficulty in picking.
Sure. And in Hellgate, there's also reader understanding of the different characters, because not everybody's human in sort of a in the sense of ordinary. So
sorry, I wasn't talking about Hellgate when I was just sort of speculating about how.
Yeah, I'm just and I can't come up with a idea off the top of my head of that kind of change, but that's valid. That could probably be possible. I'm trying to think about other indies that I've read. That have more dynamic character arcs, because I feel like the indie scene tends to be a little bit more to lean on the side of likable to likable. And if that means there's less change and development, character growth or whatever, that could be true. I'll just take a look here.
Alexander Helene's first book.
Oh, sure.
I forget the name of it. Traitor to Dreams. The main character is a sort of single cat lady type woman who has an arc where she's kind of dealing with ideas and sort of abstract things that turn into concrete realities inside this virtual reality kind of scenario. And she kind of undergoes a shift from being sort of selfish and resentful to kind of thinking more about family and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's very, very central to that book. It's not an incidental thing. It's like the organizing principle of that book. So that's a good example. That's a really good book, by the way. You should. I think Alexander Helene's new sci-fi Sword and Planet series has gotten a lot more attention than that book, but you should check it out if you haven't.
Another kind of type of book that's kind of common in the sci-fi fantasy genres is the character who begins outside of a sphere of weird or fantastic, and then once exposed to it, their approach to life changes. I would say Invocations of the Submortal was like that. That's by William Jeffrey Rankin. Let Sleeping Gods Lie by David West. That one's more of a weird Western. I guess Hellgate would probably fall under that too. I'm actually browsing my reviews page here. I'm just looking at covers.
Reading my own website. Not to toot my own horn, but I would say my books have pretty dynamic characters.
Yes, I would agree. Yep.
Sometimes in kind of subversive ways, but I guess I prefer more dynamic characters to flat art characters for the main protagonist.
Yeah.
I'd like to think my characters start likable with some flaws and kind of resolve those flaws and stay likable. Mm-hmm. So I try not to make them too bad of people at the beginning, but
yeah. Redcaps Rising by P.A. Piat. That one is actually kind of interesting because you come full circle. The main character, but like you come full circle in a way that's not returning to the same situation. The main character goes on a road trip with some fairy tale creatures, and his view of the world is fundamentally changed, and his idea about himself changes. But in the end, he's sort of going home, making a home, that kind of thing. Abort by C.D. Hullen, that's an example of somebody who goes from negative to positive. I had forgotten about that one. Mm-hmm. The main character, goes from being the primary force that is aborting the mission of this ship to being an advocate for the lives that are there. Yeah, there's a good range. Actually, I had thought most of them were flat, but I've got quite a few different examples. Mm-hmm. Fiona Wolf points out Galaxy Ascendant. Yup. That's a good one.
And that's a pretty long series too. I think you've only read the first one.
I only read the first one.
But
I fully intend to go back and read the second in all of the series that I've started.
I think we have most of those. So might be nice. Certainly over a long series, you can do some really neat things with characters. Or you can really screw up characters.
Yeah. I think once you get too long, you start trying to prevent your characters from growing too much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there comes a point where if you kept trying to make them change in different ways, they'd almost have to go bad. And this is a problem with a lot of TV shows, is like, in order to get character development, they have to put the characters into a bad spot at the beginning. That was one of my big beefs with Stranger Things season 4, is they did a whole bunch of things to characters that we've all liked and loved from previous seasons at the beginning to make them unlikable, so they'd be able to have an arc.
Yeah.
And it did actually give the characters a really satisfying arc and ended up being very good, but the first couple episodes were really rough. And I almost quit watching it over the bad spot that they put those characters into.
Yeah. The example of how not to do it. I think we see that a lot in sequels too. The couple that got together at the end happily ever after is broken up or about to break up so that they can get together again at the end. I think we might have talked this all the way out.
I think so.
Thank you guys for joining us and for helping us think of examples.
Yeah. And if there's any other examples you can think of, leave comments. If there's any particular aspect of this that you'd like to hear us talk more about, we talked a lot about different types of arcs and gave a few examples, but I'm sure we could go into more depth on one particular kind of example. If you're interested in, we could prepare more and come up with more examples. I think it's kind of fun just to categorize things and kind of take things apart and figure out how they work. So if there's things that you guys are interested in, or even just topics in general for things you'd like to hear us talk about, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah. And as always, you can always help support Indies by reading them, leaving reviews, and then just let us know what you'd like to hear more about. And we'll try and help you guys find it in alternative media. Thank you guys again. Have a good night.
See ya.